Good evening. Good to be with you. Hope that you will be comfortable commenting because we're intending on treating these sessions today and tomorrow, the sessions very much as a class type of session. So I will be throwing some questions out as well as just asking for comments in general and hope that you will participate. I think everybody benefits better when we have some participation from the group as well as the things that I have to say. Let me just give you a real quick introduction as to why I'm presenting this material. A lot of people in here know Ralph and Paula Walker. Back in 2000, we started presenting, Judy and I started presenting some marriage seminars, a lot of them off-site, marriage seminars for couples. And Ralph and Paula joined us in about 2005. And so for the last 19 or 20 years, we have been doing that together on numerous occasions. As a matter of fact, we have one coming up later this year that he and I are teaching together that's an off-site program. If you want any information on that, I'd be happy to give you that. Probably be easier tomorrow than tonight. But we've done that, and the reason I do that is because I grew up in a home that was the picture of dysfunction. My wife grew up in a home that was very much what God would expect a home of Christians to be like. That you have parents that get along, that doesn't mean there's no issues, but they get along, siblings that have rivalry but do what they're supposed to be doing, that kind of family. I grew up in a home that was as dysfunctional as it could possibly be. And you're going to see why this is so important to me, and we'll make a reference to Ephesians 5 at the end of that chapter a little bit later. But Ralph Walker taught me, we've known each other since we're about 10. So Ralph spent a lot of time trying to teach me the gospel. I wasn't raised like he was. He spent about 3 years trying to teach me the gospel when I was in high school. And I listened to everything that he had to say, but I wasn't ready to really change my life at that point. I played a lot of sports, and so giving up weekends was not really an option. And I used to go spend time at his house when I would escape mine. And after a while spending time at his house, I came to the conclusion that not only the things that he was teaching me about the Bible were correct, but as I watched his family, I really came to a conclusion that said, whatever they've got that's causing their family to be the way their family is, I need. Because that's not the way mine was. And so it truly was the fact that I got to see a picture of a godly family, and that had a bigger impact on me than even the words that he was teaching me from the scriptures. And I think that is absolutely critical that we understand that. Even as we look at the lesson tonight, I was telling Randy when we came in, I said, I feel bad because tonight's the depressing lesson. From the standpoint of, it is a lesson that's dealing with how badly culture has affected us and our thinking, and how badly it affects the concept of marriage and family and children and all that goes with that. So this series is entitled, and Ralph and I got a chance to present this material together at one of our weekend retreats. It's entitled Building Our Homes on the Rock, because in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, we have that story that even the kids sing about. You know, the wise man built, right, his house where?
On the rock.
On the rock. And the foolish man built his. So what was different about the building of the house? I'm saying the house itself.
Foundation.
The foundation was different, but what about the rest of the house? Do you get a vision that the house on the sand was built more poorly? Let's exclude the foundation. I'm saying the structure itself. Do you think it was built? Is there anything in the passage that would tell you they used worse materials? That they tried to cheapen the construction of the house? That the builder treated it any differently than the builder did who built on the rock? What about the storms? Both suffered exactly the same storms, did they not? The winds crashed against them, the waves crashed against them, you have these big storms. Both are affected by the same things, but one crashes, one does not. And that's why I think this series is so critical, because we need to understand it isn't about the structure, it is all about the foundation. And the structure is only as good as the foundation that is supporting it. And that's why he says that we build ours on the rock, Jesus Christ. That is who we build our marriages on, and that becomes a very important thing. So as we think about that, this particular lesson, as all of them, are entitled something to the along the lines of just number 1, 2, 3, 4, that kind of thing. But they're all the rain, floods, winds, assaults on marriage. Now tomorrow we're going to deal with children. You know, people think of children. Surely that's not an assault on marriage, but it is. And so we're going to talk about what that really even means. To assault marriage. In other words, challenges that are presented to married couples. And they come from a lot of different areas. Tonight we're going to look at what culture does to our thinking in regards to that. So where do most people today get their, including Christians, where are the areas that we get an idea of what marriage should be? Where do we get those ideas from?
TV.
TV? How good an image you get from TV normally? Not great. You know, it's interesting. Just think in terms of sitcoms. How many functional families have you ever seen on sitcoms? I'm saying functional the way God would describe them. It isn't that the families are always arguing, but the male leadership role falls quickly on a lot of the sitcoms. Because our culture doesn't want men to be the men that God wants them to be. And so we struggle with that as a culture. Other places we get the picture. Parents, absolutely. We learn from our parents. And so now, and I tried to get our 3 sons to understand this concept. I tried to understand it myself first and tried to get them to understand it, that everything that their children understand about being a good mother or father, depending on if you're talking about their daughters or their sons, everything they understand about that, about being a good husband or a good wife, everything will be filtered through what they see in their parents first. Doesn't mean they can't overcome that. It just means that's the first picture they have. And that's not always a good picture, is it? We're going to see the dysfunction in the home creates some of the ideas that exist in culture. I like one young boy. There was a whole survey where they would ask these young kids about marriage and about love. And they would respond in ways, anybody that's old enough to remember Art Linkletter? That ring a bell for anybody? Art Linkletter, and when he used to interview kids, they would say some pretty crazy things. A little boy by the name of Alan was asked, how do you determine who you should marry? To which he responded, you've got to find somebody that likes what you like. So if you like sports, she needs to like the idea that you like sports and keep the chips and dip coming. So I'm not sure where he heard that specifically, but if that was something he learned from his father, obviously not a great example. We see that kind of thing happening. Turn to 1 John chapter 5 for just a moment. 1 John chapter 5. Because as we talk about cultural assaults, look at what John says in 1 John chapter 5. Because here's our goal for this class, at least. How many people have ever voted? Done much voting? You ever had any problems voting? Went voting with a friend one time that had bought a boat at a house that was repossessed, and he got that as part of the payment. He asked me, he knew I fished a lot, asked me if I'd go out on the boat with him. I did. He didn't check the boat before we went out. It had a large hole, I'm saying large hole, in the bottom of the boat that he wasn't aware was there. We were in Tampa Bay. We'd only made it from here to that door, off of the boat ramp probably, and it had a hole in the subfloor, which is not a problem. But I walked toward the back of the boat and water went straight up out of the subfloor. We scrambled as fast as we could to get that boat back to shore, because putting a boat in the water, not a concern at all. Water in the boat, now you've got problems. And so Paul tells us that we are in this world, but we're what? He says we're not of it. I can't be like it. I have to live in this world. It's the only world that I have the option to live in. And so he says, here I am in this. This culture is around me, and the way that things happen are all around me, but I've got to keep them from influencing me. How good a job do we do with that? We'll talk a little bit about tonight. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 1. Who's got that will read that for me? See how confusing it is when everybody volunteers at the same time? Yes, go ahead.
Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves him who begot also loves him who is begotten of him.
And that was good, except I gave you the wrong verse. 1 John 5:21. I'm sorry. 1 John 5, verse 21.
5:21.
Yes.
Okay. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. Amen.
There you go. That's the way he concludes this letter. Little children, keep yourselves from idols. What are those idols? What do you think he's talking about? That picture that I projected in the beginning, one of those large statues, we don't deal with that concept much in this country, do we? I'm saying most of us aren't highly influenced by statues that we fall down and worship before. We know there are a lot of cultures around us that do. They did. They had a lot of idolatry issues that are that way. But what do you think he's saying to them? What are the idols that he's asking them to keep away from? I mean, that would be one of them, but that's not the only idol. What other kind of idols could they have? Could we have?
Money.
What's that?
Money.
Oh, no question. In our culture, we'll talk about that one tonight. Our culture, money is a gigantic issue as far as becoming an idol for people. I love the way the NLT words this verse. It says, "Dear children, keep away from anything that might take God's place in your hearts." That's what an idol is. An idol is something when I have taken God off the throne and I have put something else on the throne. And that can even include putting myself on the throne. Sometimes we are interested in self to the point that we exclude God. He's saying whatever it may be, that is a problem. And so think about some of the other things that God says before we get into the points that are specifically in your book. But he talks about Satan because he's saying it's important to understand this, is it not? Satan doesn't always slap you in the face and say, "I'm here to tempt you." Satan sometimes says, "Hey, look at this. Look at this." He's a good whisperer. He's good at just kind of get your attention aside a little bit. He's good at being partly truthful and partly deceitful, is he not? Isn't that exactly how he dealt with Eve? He says, "Really? Is that what God said?" That's what God said. You can't eat that. He says, "You know why God said that? Because God doesn't want you to be smart like he is. He knows you're going to get knowledge." And so he's going to take the things that are said, he's going to warp them. And we're told that. He says, he disguises himself as an angel of light. Therefore, it's not surprising if his servants also disguise themselves as servants of righteousness, whose end will be according to their deeds. But his goal is what? Peter tells you what his goal is, doesn't he? You remember what Peter says? First Peter chapter 5, he says what? Satan is what? He is a roaring lion. He says, "Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Think about how scary that is. He says, understand, it may seem innocent sometimes. He is only interested in the destruction of our souls. God wants to save us. Satan wants to destroy us. He says, and we need to be aware of how he does that. So let's look at a couple areas of idolatry tonight. Idolatry of the mind. First, in the area of the pride of life. Look at Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1. Paul's writing to these brethren. And he talks about, this is the book that tells us, look, everybody has sinned. Everybody falls short of the glory of God. He starts off in chapter 1 really dealing with the Gentiles and saying, you should have known. You should be able to look around and see the creation and understand there was a God. That you shouldn't be fooled by that. He gets in chapter 2 and later he's talking to the Jews and he says, you have the words of God, so you really have no excuse at all. He faults everybody. And in chapter 3, that's why he draws the conclusion. Everybody has sinned, fallen short of the glory of God. But in Romans chapter 1, in verses 18 through 25, he's going to deal with an intellectualism. In other words, This gets to be an idolatrous concept in our culture, and if we're not careful, it may creep in. Starting in verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God, or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. He says, so let's just talk about the way their mind worked and why that is so critical. So what do you see as some of the things he said they had problems with? And do we have problems with any of them also? What kind of things did he say?
Suppressing the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. Suppressing the truth. He said, how obvious was God, in Paul's opinion? How obvious was God? How clearly should they have seen him? Isn't that what he's saying? He says, look, God showed himself. They knew. They should have known. They reject the obvious existence of God. What about our culture? Would you say our culture fits that description? Rejects the obvious existence of God as a culture, as a society that we're in. I think absolutely. Speculation. He said they just started trying to figure out. They had their own ideas about things. From the time that probably everybody in here was little and in school. Anybody in here ever go to school when evolution was not taught? The theory of evolution, which, is it a theory? It's not even a theory by scientific definition, not even remotely a theory, a postulate at best, but it's just speculation, is it not? The whole idea is people speculating because they don't want to accept what God has said about himself. And so he says, professing wisdom, they become foolish. He says, exchanging the glory of humanity and animal for humanity and animal worship, exchanging the truth for a lie, and worshiping and serving the creature. So how all do they do that? Let me read you a couple of things. There was a publication put out called One Nation Divided: Culture, Civic Institutions, and the Marriage Divide. It was put out by the group that put it out, is as long as the title. But it says, the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University and Brookings Institution, the two combined. This was a collaboration. And they said, here's the problem in culture. It is what sociologists call expressive individualism. The idea that personal desire trumps social obligations. And that has caused Americans to feel less obligated to get and stay married, and have come to expect more fulfillment from the marriage. Now, we'll come back to that idea in just a minute. In turn, rising expectations for marriage have made Americans more hesitant to marry, quicker to divorce, and less likely to believe that marriage and parenthood must be bundled together. And that is also directly tied to the idea of the fall of people worshiping and going to church, regular church attendance. They go on to say in this study, adherence to conservative religious beliefs without attending church regularly is associated with worse family outcomes, whereas combining adherence with regular attendance is associated with better family outcomes. Why do you think that is? Why does that make a difference? In other words, I've got conservative beliefs. I believe in a God, but I don't really ever worship. I don't go with others to church. Why does that make a difference if I'm attending with other people?
We're engaging with a culture that reinforces our values.
Yeah, absolutely. It reinforces the value. How important is that? Why do we come together? Why do we come together? I mean, we sing when we're together, a lot of times, do we not? We pray. We study from the scriptures. Correct? Which of those can you not do at home? You can do all those at home, can't you? Can you worship God at home? Not only can you, you should be, right? Worshiping God in our homes. We can do all of those things at home. We don't have to be here. But he tells us specifically to come together. For what reason?
Edify one another.
To edify one another. What did I hear over here?
Edification.
Yeah, edification. He tells us in Hebrews chapter 10, the whole point of forsaking not the assembling of yourselves together, as is the habit, he says, of some. He says, before that, what? We come together that we might stimulate one another to love and to good works. We're trying to encourage. I cannot stimulate you if I am not in relationship with you. I can't stimulate you if I don't ever see you, if I don't spend time with you. And so it becomes critical that we understand how important our church family is as we're trying to defeat the idea of culture. But I want to focus a little bit more on this one, the second one, as we mentioned a second ago. Idolatry of the mind with a lust of the flesh. Starting with, we're going to look at two things, but starting with this idea as what is probably the biggest idol. And I would say probably the one that influences more of us than any other idol in our culture. I'm not going to ask you for a show of hands, but it'd be hard for me to imagine that you could ask a group of people this size, has anybody ever struggled with the concept of materialism and not have every single person acknowledge that we have? We're in a culture that makes it that way, that makes it easy to struggle with materialism. That doesn't mean that we're greedy. It's just saying that the world has affected us in how we strive for things and what we look at. And so our kids used to never understand when you say, you know, we're rich. They'd say, well, I wish we were rich. We say we are rich. So if you tell your child we are rich, what are you normally wanting them to understand? What kind of things you want your child to understand when you're saying, look, no, you need to understand we are rich.
Blessed.
We are very blessed, are we not? How rich are we? I would almost guarantee everybody sitting in this room is in the top 3% of wealth in the world. Everybody in this room. We don't normally think in those terms, do we? Because I may not be in the top 3% of wealth in my county or in my neighborhood or wherever, in my country even, but we are rich beyond imagination. And what happens is it causes us to lose track of how not only rich with the blessings of God in general and with spiritual blessings, but how rich we are even financially. We are wealthy as a people. And so it's easy for that to crowd out and becomes one of the greatest temptations for modern couples especially. Modern couples. I watched a guy on TV one day. He goes, I wish my parents could live the way we live. Figure out what it's like to have to put your shelves on cinder blocks for bookshelves. And it's like, wait, your parents were there. We were all there. We went through the days that was a struggle, but we've created a culture that makes people want things much more quickly and want much more than they would have before. And that's problematic for couples. The subprime mortgage crisis. We all remember that? That wasn't very long ago. When they were giving loans to whom?
People who couldn't afford it.
People who could not afford it. And not only did they encourage that, our government almost coerced on numerous occasions for people to do that, and this is why. They made the statement, everyone has a right to own a home. Do they? Not necessarily. But we've got a culture that does that. And so it causes couples, you've heard the expression dinks? What's dink?
Double income, no kids.
Double income, no kids. How do we end up with so many dinks at one point? Dinks were almost directly associated with level of debt. You realize that? That the more expenses a couple had, both of them had to work. and they couldn't necessarily even afford to have children. And so you have double income, no kids, because that's what it's taking to sustain the lifestyle. We've been convinced sometimes that that's what we need to have. I think God is saying, look, don't buy into that. Don't buy into that. People become disillusioned, and it's affecting our married couples as well. We need to stay away from the cultural icons that are there. Frugality, excuse me, no longer treated the way that it used to be. We've got 3 sons, all 3 different financially. I'm saying from the time they were little. How many people in here have multiple children? How many of you would say they have different approaches to money? I mean, that's pretty common, is it not? And then out of our 3, we had one that he literally would burn the hole in his pocket with a quarter. You give him a quarter, he had to be at the store immediately to buy a candy bar, when you could still buy a candy bar for a quarter. We have another one who's just kind of right in the middle. And then we have one that saves everything he ever got. You know, he's the kid with Halloween candy last until October 30th the next year. That was the method of the way he dealt with things. We went out to buy a Christmas gift one time for Judy. And I've got the 3 boys at the store, and I said, they found something they wanted to get her. It was $15. I said, I'll cover the tax. I just need $5 from each of you. Our youngest son opened his little wallet. He was only about 10 or 11, something like that. Opened his wallet. He goes, Dad, I don't have anything smaller than a 20. Well, I don't even have any 20s in my wallet. 20s in your wallet. But he kept all his birthday money. He stockpiled everything. So he's got that approach. You know, a lot of us don't do that. Thankfully, the oldest one, who's the senior, married an extremely frugal young lady. And so that has made an incredible difference in their lives. But it's important. God says things like this. You remember in Proverbs chapter 24, we're not going to turn to all of these just for the sake of time. But in Proverbs 24, he talks about, the writer of Proverbs says, I passed by a field. He said, the field was all overgrown with weeds because you had somebody that was lazy and didn't want to do what he needed to do in the field. And so God says, laziness doesn't work. God says, you need to work. That's good. He's not telling you don't need to have it all. He's saying it needs not to be the priority. In Matthew chapter 6, you remember Jesus having the discussion with people and saying, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And so what did he tell them to do? God says, I'll take care of my part, which was what? What did he tell them not to worry about? You remember? Yeah, he said, what you're going to wear, the food, the shelter. He says, let God take care of what God said he'll do for his people. He says, and what do we need to do? Yeah, we need to put treasures in heaven and to seek God and his righteousness and to strive for that. In Luke chapter 12, you have a man who is doing extremely well, and he's got this bumper crop. And what does he say? He goes, this is incredible. Let me tear down my barns and build bigger barns and get all this. He says, because then I'm going to be able to just sit back and take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And what was he told? You're a fool. This night, your soul shall be required of you. God wants us to understand that. In Luke chapter 12, as you look at that whole story, he says, look, be on guard against all kinds of greed. Life doesn't consist in the abundance of possessions, whether you have a little or a lot. He says, understand, possessions can get hold of you. You have things right now that you had that you haven't used for years? Who'd be willing to raise their hand for that? Say, I've got things I haven't used for years. So is there a reason we still have it? Or are there some of them we probably should get rid of? Anybody ever read the book Celebration of Discipline by Richard Foster? Good book. And he talks about one of the disciplines is simplicity. Going in and just getting rid of stuff. Not garage sale stuff. You know, I got stuff I don't mind getting rid of. You know, you want to get rid of it as fast as you can. And you have the garage sale. And that's when you find out how worthless it is because nobody else wants to buy it. What do you do when you go in and just get rid of stuff that is useful? I mean, it was a discipline for them and for him. Just simplicity, going in and being willing to say, I'm going to prove to myself that my possessions don't own me. Very easy for them to do that. In the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, you remember the prodigal son? What was his problem? He had wealth coming to him, didn't he? But what was his problem? When did he want it?
Right now.
He wanted it right now. He told his father, let me have my portion right now. He would have gotten that portion. It was his portion in the inheritance. Let me have it right now. Sometimes we don't have the patience to wait for the things that God will do for us. In Philippians chapter 4, the passage where Paul says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. What's the context of that passage? Anybody know?
Learning to be content.
Learning to be content. Paul's not talking about, I had a girl one time who said her parents used this verse when she was struggling in algebra. I don't think Philippians 4:13 was saying if you want to learn algebra, you can learn algebra. Some people may learn it, some people may not, I don't know. But Paul was talking specifically about having and not having. And he said, I've learned to be content. What sticks out at you when you read that? There's one part of that phrase that really sticks out at me.
You have to learn it.
You have to learn it.
It's not necessarily natural for us.
Including with Paul, was it? Paul doesn't say, you know what, I've always been content. He had to go through those experiences. He said, I've learned that whether I have something or I don't have something, that isn't what life is about. And so married couples need to understand we can get so focused on providing for our family and providing better for our family and working harder to provide for our family that it is detrimental to the family we're trying to provide for. That is an idol in this country. I don't remember how old our kids were. I think Matthew, our oldest son, was, I don't know, maybe 5, something like that. And I was working for a company, but we were starting our own company doing design work in Florida. I used to do house design and heating, ventilation, air conditioning design, that kind of thing. And we're starting this company. Anybody who's ever started their own company realizes you start a company, it takes money, it doesn't pay money to start with. It takes a while before it's producing much of anything for you. And so because of that, I took another job. So I'm starting a company, I'm working full-time for a company. I took another job because it was approaching Christmas time, and I didn't want the kids not to have something. And so we're making sure that I'm working hard. I went, I think it was 7 days, without seeing any of our 3 sons awake. 7 days. Living in the same house, never seeing them awake. They were asleep when I went to work. By the time I ever got home that night, they were in bed again and asleep. I didn't see them awake for 7 days. You remember how old Matthew was? 5 or 6? Somewhere around there? Was he even that old? Probably not even that old. 4 or 5 maybe then? He came up to me and said, when I grow up, I'm going to work all the time and you can miss me. I'm telling you, the kids will help you understand what matters. We need to make sure that we are not buying into this idea. And so he says, watch out for that. Materialism then also leads to hedonism, which is what he goes into next in Romans. When he starts talking about in verse 26 and following, he says, and let me read this a little bit. He says, for this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women, were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the penalty due their error. And since they do not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil covetousness, malice. They are full of envy and strife, deceit and maliciousness. They are gossips and slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. They are not only do them, but they give approval to those who practice them. When does that sound like it was written?
Yesterday.
Sounds like it was written yesterday, doesn't it? When you think about our culture, and so that's what we want to think about for a few minutes, this whole idea of our culture and sexual suicide, all the unnatural affections, we're living in a culture that just says two consenting adults. That's the whole idea, is it not, of the culture we live in, of the society? Do you think that has any influence on your children? Do you think children in homes of Christians will hear this message enough that it may affect the way that they think? It does. We need to understand that it affects them. They abandon the natural function, he says, depraved minds to do that which is not proper. And so God wants us to understand that's the culture we're dealing in. That report went on to say, second, the changes in mores and behavior associated with the sexual revolution diminish the connection between sex, marriage, and parenthood, thereby making marriage less necessary and non-marital childbearing more acceptable and more common. With those claiming, now I understand it's not just within our brethren, but still, those claiming to be church-going Christians, it has raised by over 1,000% in the last 2 decades to cohabit before marriage. How does that even happen? Because the culture is convincing people that it is okay. It is encouraged. They don't see it as a problem. So I just have got a study coming up with a young man. He came to me the other day, just baptized into Christ, I don't know, a couple weeks ago or so. We were able to baptize him into Christ. And thrilled about that. And he came up, and he's been dating a girl for quite a while. And he said, we want to come talk to you. You know, as a preacher, Lawrence probably does this, get premarital counseling. Someone's thinking about getting married, and they want to talk about marriage. He says, but I got to tell you, he said, I'm really, really behind the curve here, and I'm really confused. He says, because I don't know anything at all about marriage. He said, my parents have been together for 30 years, and they are not married. My grandparents were not married. So he says, my advice I'm getting from home is, you need to spend time living with this person before you ever make a commitment to something like marriage. That's the culture we are in. And it affects the minds of some of our younger people. And that is why. Anybody here ever know of a Christian couple that cohabited before they got married? I think probably most of us know. You can certainly answer that question by how many of us know somebody who has become pregnant before they were ever married, who were Christians, both the guy and the girl. The culture makes that not only seem more acceptable, it makes it seem as that is in fact what we should be striving for, is that kind of relationship. And so he says, here's the other problem. Here's what scares me more, especially as we think about our children. He says, they give hearty approval. I have had conversations with several Christians who feel like we need not to teach about certain things. Young Christians. You know what? Let them make their own choices. God says the truth is the truth. Paul says that that's a debased life they live, and we need to do that and make sure. I'm not going to spend any time on these two because I can't imagine I could find a Christian who says, I've got no issue with these things. But this is our culture. Gender issues, blurring the distinctions, even denying that they exist. I always loved when Ben Carson was running for president. He said, you know what? Just bring me a blood sample. I'll tell you. I'll tell you if they're male or female. I mean, that's all it takes for the doctor to make that determination. But we got a culture that says you don't know. Nobody knows that. And so it's in sports, it's in the workplace, it's in the marketplace. Had issues with it in this last Olympics, did we not? The whole gender bending issue, all the things that go along with that, is that ever going to come into God's people? We need to be aware of how close that is. as we think about that, here's from October of 2018, International Pronoun Day. International Pronoun Day. Referring to people by the pronouns they determine for themselves is basic to human dignity. Together we can transform society to celebrate people's multiple intersecting identities. Okay, I'm just saying this is the culture that our kids are growing up in. So whether or not we are fooled by any of that or not, it becomes progressively harder for them to be able to do and to understand. Redefining marriage, the decision that was made regarding the Obergefell versus Hodges that allowed same-sex marriage and granting all the same rights. We understand that that's against God's law, but that is, I just want you to picture a generation from now, as your children are growing up and they're raising children, that will be the standard of society. It'll be accepted across the board. We need to be careful about that. But here's where I want to spend just the remaining time we have tonight. De-emphasizing marriage. See that quote on the bottom, marriage is not relevant? How many people you think would make that statement? Not just, I'm not going to get married. Marriage is not relevant. How many people you think would make that? 40%. 40% feel that marriage is not relevant. I have talked to young Christians who say, I don't need to get married. I am good on my own. It's not because I am called to serve God as a single. That's a wonderful thing. You can serve God without getting married. That's not the issue. But if you feel like marriage doesn't even need to be a part of life, God said, that's not true. It does need to be a part of life. And not only for some, but I would tell you, God would tell you for most. He created marriage in the garden and intended that that be the way that we continue to propagate the race and to get people to continue to serve Him. But 40% of adults say that marriage is not relevant. Living together before marriage. The idea is 2020. 29% of people say it's very important for couples with children to be together, to be legally married. 29% say that's important. Is that scary, that number? 29% say it's important for them to be married. That's down from 49% in 2006. 38% of Americans say it's important for couples to marry if they plan to live together for the rest of their lives. That's down from 54% in 2006. Those who claim again to be Christians, 65% of attendees to regular weekly church services said it is important that that couples with children together legally marry. That share fell to 45% in 2020. 20% of those who said it's just not that important. And I understand these are depressing numbers, but here's what we need to understand about our kids. I think they're swimming in a cultural ocean, if you will. That they're fighting against this. It is not marriage friendly, the culture we are in. And so they spend an hour or two at church in a week, and then they are swimming against the tide the rest of the time. Cohabitation is now the fastest growing family form in this country. Not marriage. Marriage always dominated before, family form. Cohabitation without marriage is now the largest, fastest growing form of that. We need to understand the problem. We're going to read you a quote, because here's one of the, anybody ever talk about a soulmate? You ever anybody talk about a soulmate? The governor of South Carolina, Mark Sanford, said he had met his soulmate, but that he would try to fall back in love with his wife. Now, I'm telling you, that's an exact picture of what's being portrayed. Do we understand what marriage is about? I would tell you, I hope every older couple especially would help children understand it isn't about finding your soulmate. It's about pursuing God with the person you choose to pursue God with, and the two of you will become the kinds of soulmates that God wants you to become. We need to make sure that it's a spiritual drive first. Living together instead of marriage and delayed marriage. The age of marriage is just increasing and increasing. Why do you think that is? Because it is de-emphasized in our culture. Finally, tonight, And I'm hoping you're not going to walk out of here too depressed tonight. This is just kind of saying, look, this is the culture we're in. And then we get to talk about how do we work against those things, the Lord willing. We get to talk about that tomorrow in other aspects of life. But how do we keep the water out of the boat? I would tell you first, watch our terminology. Watch your terminology around your kids. Anybody know what the word circumlocution means? We don't use that word often. Circumlocution would be, we just had a member of the congregation who died just this past week. And so if I was to say of that person, she passed on, that's a circumlocution. It still tells you what happened, but it's to soften the blow. Because a lot of us don't like to say, so-and-so died. People say they passed. That's a very common thing. That's a circumlocution. People talk about people having affairs. I would tell you there may not be a more damaging circumlocution than to use that word, because that makes it sound somehow pleasant. We need to use terminology to help our children understand what it is. When people have an adulterous relationship, we need to make sure we identify it as an adulterous relationship. That is what God identifies it as. It is important, if we're going to help them understand that's an ugly thing, we need to be willing to use the terms that will help them to understand that. And so there, people in this culture say what? It's an alternate lifestyle. Not an alternate lifestyle. It's sinful behavior. And we need to be willing to identify sinful behavior. There's a book written by, I think it's written by Josh McDowell, or John MacArthur. One of those two wrote it, but it's called Whatever Happened to Sin. Great concept in the book. He's saying we've identified everything as some kind of alternative life, or we've determined it as a sickness, or he said, you know what, there's still sin. People are making wrong choices. We need to be able to identify that and be willing to identify that. But then I would tell you, most of all, how do you talk about marriage in general and your marriage in particular for other people? I do a lot of counseling, if you will, with couples after marriage as well, at various levels of struggling. One of the couples, I told him, I said, I really want you guys to work on praising each other. I want you to praise each other. And praise each other around other people. In particular, that would be like toward their church, with their church family. So they were working on that. The preacher and one of the elders, while they were doing that, talking about how wonderful their marriage was, while they were doing that, the preacher of that congregation and one of the elders both made an almost identical comment to them, very close together, said, yeah, wait till you're married for 15 years. Now, how good should we talk about the blessing that God has given us in marriage? We need to make sure that we're building it up to our kids, explaining to them how important marriage is, taking them to Ephesians 5 and saying, this is why this is doing marriage. That makes it important, doesn't it? Remember David being told by Nathan, he's going to lose a child. And he was told what? Because you have given occasion to the enemy to blaspheme the name of God. He had done some horrendous things. But the prophet said, here's why you're going to lose your child, because you made God look bad. We need to do everything we can to make God look good in this relationship, because it is the most important earthly relationship you will ever have. The only relationship that trumps it is your relationship with God himself. This is the earthly relationship. And then finally, show the world. We got to get back to reverence for God and his word. We have to do that. We have to help our children replace that cultural world view with what God would have us to understand, because I honestly believe we will likely be called on to contend for our faith in ways that we never thought we would have to do. We have seen persecution for faith. I'm honestly telling you, in the culture we're in, if it doesn't change, we're not terribly far from seeing prosecution for our faith. We don't think that's ever coming to this country, but I'm telling you, that culture changes the people. Make sure that we understand. I don't want the water to get in the boat. I need to do everything I can to pursue God with everything that I have. Anybody have any questions or anything tonight? And I'll know how bad I depressed you. Half the crowd shows up tomorrow. Trust me, we're talking about children tomorrow, and it's not the same level of discussion. But we're talking about children tomorrow and talking about internet and technology. How does internet and technology affect a married couple? We'll get a chance, Lord willing, to talk about that tomorrow. And then finally, on Sunday, we're going to talk about, so when the storm has damaged the house, then what do? How do you repair storm damage? Yes?
What are your recommendations for terminology to communicate to children about choosing a mate, a marriage spouse, and combating the culture that says, oh, you fall in love and you find your soulmate, without, making it seem so just like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think some of it, for me, using Bible stories is a great way to do that as well. One of my favorite stories is when you look back and you see the whole idea of Isaac and Rebekah and this meeting of one another. Do you remember how she's described by God? You may remember what it says about her? It says she was beautiful. Do you ever think about that? I'm saying if God's the one who says, I'm telling you, drop dead gorgeous. What do you think? You're thinking, wow, no wonder he married her, right? He saw this absolute knockout. Why wouldn't he marry her? You know what? He didn't see her. So they went in the tent together. She was veiled. I think that you can help children understand that these were two people that were determined, and the whole point of that marriage was to find a godly person who would help me grow closer to God. And that is the most important thing. So I try to make sure that when we're talking to kids, they understand what really is the purpose of the marriage. Because, and Judy doesn't appreciate this, but I've told this when we did a marriage seminar. I said, you realize, I understand, someday I'm going to be married to an ugly woman. I'm saying by the world's standard, she's going to be wrinkled. She looks way younger than everybody thinks I robbed the cradle. We're not that far apart, but she's going to be wrinkled someday. By the world's standards, people aren't going to look at her and say, wow, she's just beautiful. But she'll be more beautiful then even than she is now, to me, if I understand what beauty is. So I try to help the kids understand what really is beautiful and what matters. And because you will fall out of love. When I do weddings, sometimes I let people, it's like you got standing before you two people with butterflies in their hearts and rocks in their heads. They think there's not even going to be any problem. Good luck with that. It doesn't work. I don't care. You can't find the right person. You need to be the right person. You need to be the right person. Somebody gave me advice one time, says, you ever find the perfect church, don't join it. You'll ruin it. I would tell somebody that's thinking about a spouse the same way, you know what, you find the perfect spouse, don't marry her because you're going to ruin her. Because you're not perfect. Understanding that we are flawed people, all of us, and so it's not going to be romance that holds it together. It will not be. Infatuation, we do a whole lesson on that concept. Romance will not hold a marriage together. It takes the depth of the kind of love that God has for us. Any other questions? You guys have been very patient. All the lessons are not quite as long as this one, so I do very much appreciate your patience in letting us get through this whole material tonight, and I do hope you'll come back tomorrow so we can talk about the kids and how they affect marriage. What do we do about that? Because kids are an assault on marriage in multiple different ways. Technology is an assault. What do we do about that? Appreciate so much your attention tonight. No other questions at all? Thank you guys so much for coming.